"Sorry, sir, no valid permit, no docking," the Coast Guard officer intoned, his voice even and unfeeling. On Boston's wind-whipped pier, an old man leaned on his cane, his hair salt white, standing silently beside the weathered wooden boat named Guiding Light. In his hand, he clutched a dulled metal compass, once the instrument he used to guide hundreds of sailors safely across the sea. Elliot Garner, age 79, had been a veteran naval pilot, but today he was merely an old man refused return to the place he'd called home his entire life. He said nothing. He only gripped his cane tighter and stared out at the ocean, as if searching for something that had yet to vanish. Yet less than 30 minutes later, the waters offshore parted as a Navy fleet sailed into the bay, led by a majestic destroyer. And its commanding officer, the very man Elliot had first taught to hold a compass, had returned, bearing honor and a long overdue thank you. What could compel an entire fleet to reappear for just one old boat? Subscribe to Veteran Best Stories to uncover this moving story in full. Elliot Garner was unlike the other old men one might see in Boston's waterfront neighborhood. He did not blend into the busy mornings at the bakery, nor did he gather to play chess under the park's old trees like the others. Instead, he chose a quiet corner, a weathered wooden house facing straight out to the bay, where dawn's light always arrived first, and the sea breeze whispered through every crack, as if to remind him of yesterday's promise and today's duty. He lived alone, no children, no clamor, no proud recounting of naval exploits in his eyes. Rather, each morning he polished the faded brass compass in his hand, inspected every bit of rope on the old wooden boat named Guiding Light, and quietly sat on its side, jotting a few lines into the maritime logbook he had kept since 1968. Each page of that logbook held a memory, not of thunderous victories, but of nights when the sea roared in fury, of moonless skies, of silent lessons passed from teacher to young sailors stepping aboard for the first time. To Elliot, Guiding Light was not merely a vessel, it was the only tangible piece of soul he could touch. On that deck, he had taught hundreds how to read the stars, how to keep calm when storms struck, and how to find themselves amid the vast, directionless expanse. He never wrote these lessons down, but every sailor he trained carried them in their hearts. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Elliot felt the wind's steady, low rhythm, proof that the sea would be gentle. He slipped the boat's lines, adjusted the rudder, and guided Guiding Light smoothly across the placid water, heading for the familiar pier where he moored his boat each week. No ceremony, no special preparations. For him, bringing the old boat home was as simple as breathing. Yet the turning point came just minutes after he approached the dock. 2 Coast Guard officers in uniform blocked the landing ramp. They carried no threat in their posture, but their rigidity was unmistakable. One raised his hand to signal, "Stop," while the other advanced with an unreadable expression. They asked for his operational permit, the new type mandated by updated regulations, which Elliot had never heard of. He felt no anger, no urge to argue. He simply reached into his coat pocket for the compass, lifting it gently, as though it were an ancient pass, a silent testament. "I know what I am doing. I have lived my life by these coordinates." Yet the younger officer's eyes did not waver at such subtlety. They looked at him not with hostility, but with the impatience of a generation in a hurry and terrified of responsibility. To them, he was a stubborn old man refusing to adapt to new rules. So, with a few curt words, Elliot Garner, once the man who had taught hundreds of officers how to navigate in war, was asked to turn around and leave the dock as though he were a stranger. He said nothing. Quietly, he steered guiding light back out to the bay, mooring her in a corner far from the shore, then returned to land alone in his small dinghy. No one noticed him. No one watched him depart. He was as silent as an ancient tree uprooted from the garden he had tended for half a century. The dock remained crowded, engines roaring, hurried footsteps of people unaware of the years he had endured. Elliot walked slowly, each step as though he were convincing himself not to let tears spill over. He found an empty concrete block at the water's edge and sat down, pulling the compass from his pocket. The needle still spun. It still pointed north, just as always. But today, the man holding it was not certain what direction meant in a world that had forgotten the one who once guided its course. In that moment, his heart weighed heavy, not from insult, but from an indescribable emptiness. Part of him had hoped, even if only slightly, that someone, anyone, would recognize who he was. But no one came forward. No one called his name. And in that silence, Elliot understood that the values he had upheld had been swept away by the rapid current of the modern world. Yet the one thing that remained by his side was the compass. Its needle still spun, not for anyone, but because that was its purpose. And he, like that needle, remained steadfast in pointing toward what was right, even when no one watched. Elliot moored his boat well offshore, where the waves were nothing more than the steady breath of the sea, then returned to the dock in his small dinghy. The breeze sifted through his salt-white hair and the worn folds of his coat, carrying the same briny scent it had for countless years. He stepped slowly on the dock's cool bricks, each footfall seeming to recede deeper into his memories. Every surrounding sound, ship horns, footsteps, passing conversations, faded before the silence enveloping him. Finding a seldom-noticed corner, he sat on a concrete block as the sun cast a thin ribbon of light across his shoulders, reminding him the day still went on. He sighed quietly, then retrieved from his coat pocket the object he knew so well, the compass that had guided him through many stormy seasons. Its needle still turned, rhythmic and true, like a faithful friend who never betrayed. He stared intently at that motion, as if he could hear whispers from the past woven into the wind. Then he closed his eyes, not to rest, but to summon the faces that had once filled his view. Hundreds of students, each carrying a story, a hope, a private fear, as they faced the sea for the first time. Some had brimmed with confidence, some had panicked, some had remained silent, yet their eyes had held an entire universe of yearning to live and to grow. Elliot did not recall all their names, but he remembered their gazes, their gait, how they held the compass or unfolded the chart. It all replayed like a film within him. Among those memories, only one man shone with clarity as if it were only yesterday: Caleb Rhodes. A young lieutenant then, slim and awkward as a gust of spring breeze. Yet something in Caleb kept Elliot from looking away, not because he stood out, but because a quiet resilience burned within him. In Caleb's eyes, always fixed on the chart, his hand poised on the compass as though ready to absorb the world in one afternoon. Caleb was not the most skilled, but he was the one who never gave up, a rare quality when an entire generation often let go at the first sign of hardship. Elliot had mentored Caleb privately for 2 weeks when their ship became stranded near treacherous reefs. On nights when the signal died and the vessel hung between sea and sky, all that remained was clarity of mind and faith in what they had learned. Elliot taught Caleb not with theory, but by letting him hold the compass, make mistakes, and then rediscover the heading. One night, When the fog closed in so thick that only heartbeats were audible, Caleb's hand trembled, but Elliot did not interfere. It was that very night the young lieutenant learned the most crucial lesson. Orientation comes not only from instruments, but from the resolve of the one wielding them. Years later, Elliot had heard of the 1968 victory in the Sulu Sea. A key factor in that success was precise navigation when technical support was unavailable. Among the commanding officers, the name Caleb Rhodes was spoken of as the man who led the squad through jamming waters using traditional methods: handheld compass, star navigation, and paper charts. Elliot did not need the press to confirm his own role. He simply sat at his wooden desk, opened the old logbook, and reread the entry he had written for Caleb. When technology falls silent, the leader's heart must speak instead. Sitting on the dock today, Elliot did not expect anyone to call his name. He did not wait for an apology from the men who had ordered him away, nor did he wish for someone to approach and inquire about the compass he carried. He only felt regret. Regret that his old legs no longer had the strength to cross the pier that bore his footprints for so many years. Regret that the sea remained blue, the wind continued to blow, yet people had forgotten what once kept them safe, not the instruments, but the human being standing behind them. Yet within him, there was a serenity difficult to name. Not joy, nor hope, but a self-contained peace. Elliot knew that if someone still remembered, that memory would not sink. For the sea never swallows those who once loved it with total devotion. And a memory, if passed on by action, by people like Caleb, requires no spoken reminder. It lives on, weaving through the paths of the next generation, quietly present, but never fading. The wind gusted stronger, sending a dry leaf skittering past his shoes before it drifted into the sea. Elliot watched it go, then gently gripped his compass again. The needle still pointed north, and he remained the one who knew the way, even if no one asked for directions. The distant horn's mournful blast echoed like a slow drum beat, yet forceful enough to shatter the harbor's hush. Idle gazes and hurried footsteps all froze. Everyone turned toward the sea. A thin mist on the water seemed to recede, as though making room for something grander moving in. Then, through the veil of sea spray, gray steel loomed. Not one, but a formation of ships, each gliding silently across the bay. 5 Navy vessels, aligned as if rehearsed for centuries, cleaved through the waves toward the port. Leading them was the mighty destroyer USS Mariner. Its white hull numbers stood out like a summons that could not be ignored. The crowd murmured, whispers spreading like wildfire. Coast Guard crew exchanged astonished glances, hands fumbling over radios. Clearly no one had planned for or announced this sudden solemn arrival. Elliot remained seated. He needed neither question nor guess. In his heart, this movement carried a familiar rhythm, as if an old melody had reached its long-awaited crescendo. He tightened his grip on the compass in his hand, fingers trembling not with age, but with a growing certainty. On the deck of USS Mariner, a figure emerged. Tall, sturdy, silver hair graying at the temples, time's mark, yet it did nothing to dull the bearing of a man accustomed to responsibility at sea. He lowered the binoculars he'd held, meeting the world with an unflinching gaze. When his eyes found Elliot on the dock, he did not hesitate. He raised his hand in a single, unhurried wave. No words were needed. That gesture alone declared the truth. He knew exactly who sat there. He turned toward the radio, voice firm and unwavering. "Drop anchor, prepare the gangway, we disembark." With that command, The entire ship began a sequence of motions rehearsed to perfection, as though the fleet had existed solely for this moment. Minutes later, amid the milling crowd of onlookers, a man in crisp white uniform stepped down from the gangway. His dress uniform was immaculately pressed. Each step was measured and resolute. He did not survey the faces around him. He did not seek applause. He simply walked, each footfall deliberate, toward the silver-haired man sitting alone at the water's edge. That face. No introduction required. Caleb Rhodes, now Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, no longer the awkward young lieutenant of yesteryear. Yet in each measured step he took, one thing remained unchanged: gratitude. Elliot looked up as that figure approached. In his eyes was recognition that needed no confirmation. The two paused before one another. No elaborate salute, no ceremony, no cheers. Only a sacred silence, eyes meeting not as ranks in the military, but as two souls forever indebted to one another by what could not be spoken in orders or titles. Caleb bent down, saying little. His hand pressed against Elliot's shoulder, strong yet gentle, as if offering support for a weight long carried by the old man before him. Then, voice husky with emotion, he spoke slowly, every word resonating so that no bystander could mistake its meaning. Today, I bring back the compass you gave me, along with this entire fleet. No applause, no cheers. But in that moment, the space became hushed. The onlookers, Coast Guard, the crowd filming on phones, fell silent. They all understood that some things are too sacred to be disrupted by noise. Elliot did not reply. He did not need to. Inside him, a gentle wave rose, not tears, but a feeling more profound than any words could convey. He locked eyes with Caleb, his former pupil, and saw there not only success, but continuation. Proof that what he had given, the values he had preserved, had not vanished. They had been safeguarded, nurtured, and now returned in the most beautiful form: genuine gratitude. The fleet remained anchored silently behind them on the bay. The compass in Elliot's hand lay still, but it was no longer a tool to find direction. It was a symbol whose mission had been fulfilled. And amid the gentle lapping of waves and the late afternoon sun scattering across the water like broken shards of light, a teacher and his student stood side by side. No proclamation needed, yet everyone understood. This was a moment of justice, a moment when personal history and national history intersected in absolute silence, and in that calm, the heart's voice rang louder than any horn from beyond the horizon. Elliot still sat there, hands resting lightly on his cane, his gaze fixed on the image of his old student standing firm amid the crowd. He said nothing. There was no need for words. Language at that moment could not contain the flood of emotions stirring within him. The highs and lows of time, the long days spent unrecognized, the nights he sat alone on his boat's deck, convinced everything he had taught would sink into oblivion, all of it quietly melted away like morning mist. In the distance, a group of reporters began to arrive. Cameras lifted, microphones coming to life. They jostled to get a better view, eager to capture an image whose significance they did not yet comprehend. But Elliot paid no mind to their bustle. To him, all external sounds were nullified. Only the echo within his chest remained, like the steady pulse of the waves, silent, yet impossible to extinguish. Caleb turned around, heedless of cameras or flashes. He needed no preparation. He simply spoke what the world should have known long ago. His voice was neither loud nor shaky, but full of force, as though each sentence struck home in every heart standing there. This man, once chief instructor at the Atlantic Training Station, trained over 600 maritime officers, including me and most of today's Navy command staff. A wave of silence swept across the dock. Faces that had earlier wondered why an entire fleet had come now showed astonishment. They looked at Elliot, not as the silver-haired old man with distant eyes, but as the one who had once stood amid storms, guiding hundreds to find their way across the vast sea. Caleb continued, voice steady and sure. During the 1968 Sulu Gulf engagement, when our navigation systems were completely jammed, it was the skills he taught us that allowed us to recalibrate our coordinates and secure victory before night fell. Without him, no such victory would have been possible. There was no cheering, no shouting, but that very silence carried more weight than any thunderous applause. Everyone understood that what they had heard was not a speech. It was testimony, a recognition finally given after too many silent years. From behind, a young sailor stepped forward. He did not look at the cameras, nor toward the crowd. Instead, he carefully made his way to Elliot, carrying a Navy-sealed envelope. His movement was deliberate, almost reverent. He bowed slightly and offered the envelope with both hands, as though presenting a sacred symbol. Elliot looked up, but did not hurry to open it. His hands rested lightly on the paper, sensing every fiber as if he could touch the long journey it represented. When he opened the envelope, the document inside glowed clearly in the slanting sunlight. It was an official decree, signed and stamped, affirming that the boat Guiding Light was granted permanent, unrestricted docking rights, regardless of current regulations. A special dispensation, but more than that, an acknowledgement. And then, for the first time that day, the crowd applauded. Not in unison, not loudly, but individual bursts of genuine, heartfelt clapping rose from various directions, as though everyone understood they were witnessing something rare. Elliot dipped his head slightly, as if to thank them, though in truth, to hide a faint tremor in his gaze. He looked down at the compass still resting in his left hand. It was the same old needle, still turning as smoothly as on the day he first received it. But today, it no longer pointed merely north. It seemed to indicate an invisible coordinate within people's hearts, where recognition resides after a lifetime of quiet dedication. Within Elliot, something closed. Not an end, but a fulfillment. He had never needed applause, nor certificates, nor a dais of honor. But now, as those whose lives he had touched, those who had learned from him how to hold their course amid storms, returned with an entire fleet and words of earnest thanks, he knew that journey had never been in vain. The wind stirred the dock once more. The flag on USS Mariner flapped in the breeze. The water sparkled like 1,000 tiny mirrors, reflecting a moment no one dared to forget. And there, on that familiar pier, stood an old man with his cane, his compass, and now that official decree in hand. No words needed, yet conveying a life lived on true course. It was not the moment Elliot broke into a broad smile. Rather, it was when he gently squeezed the compass in his hand, as though discovering a direction no longer marked on any chart, but located in the hearts of others. And in that place, he found what he had sought his entire life: recognition beyond any request. Not long after that day's events, a special invitation arrived for Elliot from the Naval Training Center in Newport. He was invited to return, not as a solitary veteran, but as an honored instructor, the teacher whose name still passed among young officers in whispered stories between training sessions. It was the first time in 20 years he stepped onto a classroom lectern. Though the floorboards had been replaced, and the LED lights felt colder than the dim glow of years past. In Elliot's heart, the place beat with the same familiar rhythm, the heartbeat of one who passes knowledge forward. He carried no syllabus, no PowerPoint slides, no color-printed charts, no touchscreen. He placed only one item on the table: his weathered compass, its needle darkened, the brass rim tarnished. Facing dozens of young faces, puzzled to find no projection on the screen, he stood quietly for a moment, letting his gaze hold theirs before he began to speak. He did not speak as a storyteller. There was no theatrical cadence, no dramatic opening, no swell of tension. He spoke as though he were on a ship's deck, the wind whipping at his shoulders and the sea surrounding him on all sides. He described a time when he had been lost in fog, when the radar was silent and everyone's eyes turned to him, waiting on some instinct for survival. He explained how to determine direction by the stars, how to read the wind, and the bone-chilling stillness one feels when realizing a student will never return. But he did not speak from sorrow. Not once did Elliot let emotion warp his voice. Every detail, every image, he offered with deep respect for those who had shared that journey with him, both the living and the departed. His stories carried no tragedy. Rather, they were like silent prayers sent out toward the ocean, where he had given his youth and his loyalty. Each lesson Elliot shared was like a plank fit into a ship's hull, unostentatious, yet sturdy enough for someone to cling to without faltering. He did not lecture in technical jargon. He spoke in the language of lived experience. He pointed out why reading a nautical chart does not begin with paper, but with eyes that have witnessed countless dawns and dusks at sea. He explained why holding one's course is not merely a skill, but a way of life. The young trainees, initially leaning forward, expecting slides, now sat upright, arms folded or resting quietly on the table. None spoke. None glanced at their phones. The only sound in that classroom was Elliot's calm voice echoing like gentle waves lapping against rock. Some students had heard of him before, but for most, it was their first encounter with the name Elliot Garner. Yet after a single session, no one left without carrying something deeper than knowledge, a sense, a resonance of responsibility and vigilance. When that first lecture ended, the late afternoon sun still streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow on the silent compass atop the lectern. Elliot packed away his things simply, preparing to depart as though he had never arrived. But then, a young student, still quite young, ran forward, eyes shining not with mere curiosity, but with a kind of yearning. He paused, breathless, then asked in a voice trembling yet sincere, "Sir, could you teach me how to hold a compass steady?" Elliot turned back. He was not surprised. His eyes softened, but not with weakness. He placed a hand on the student's shoulder, gentle, not pressing, just enough to convey what words alone could not. He looked deep into the boy's eyes, then replied with a phrase that required no further explanation. "Start by keeping your heart steady." In that moment, there was no background music, no applause. Yet the student remained rooted to the spot, as if he had just heard something that would stay with him for life. Elliot walked away, leaving behind the room, the desk, and the gaze that still followed him. That evening, he returned the compass to its old wooden box as always. But this time, he knew one thing for certain. It was no longer merely a vessel of memory. It had become an invitation, meant for the next generation. And Elliot, once asked to leave a harbor for lacking proper papers, now sat in the very training center that had invited him, there to pass on the one thing no document could ever grant, the compass of character in a directionless sea of life. Today, the guiding light still rests at its old berth on Boston Harbor. The wind still whistles through its mast. The water still laps gently against its wooden hull, but no one sees it as just a boat anymore. Locals call it the Wayfinder, not only because the faded name painted on its side hints at its past, but because its silent presence has become a symbol of lessons that need no words. Elliot Garner no longer makes the daily trip down to the dock as he once did. Age and health have drawn him back to a small house near the shore, where the window frame still faces the water. On days when he feels particularly reflective, he simply sits and watches the vessel from afar, as if knowing it remains there is all he needs to feel connected to the convictions he held throughout his life. The boat no longer sails, yet it continues another mission, preserving the invisible values of kindness and perseverance. Young trainees from the Newport Training Center, each preparing for their first offshore exercises, stop by as a matter of course. They step onto the weathered deck without fanfare, not at anyone's bidding. They merely arrive, lightly touch the compass hanging by the helm, as if making a silent vow or seeking an intangible bearing that no chart can provide. No one taught them to do this, no ceremony, no official record. Yet over the years, that gesture has become a quiet tradition, a tribute to the teacher none of them ever met, yet all know by name. Elliot has never needed to be present in person. Still, his influence endures, in the way young mariners find their balance when the seas rise, in how they remember that first their hearts must be steady before a compass can be. Elliot never proclaimed himself a role model. He simply performed the duties of a guide, tirelessly, through simple stories rather than grand lectures. His legacy is not medals or articles, but the ripple of a life philosophy, that doing what is right requires no loud declarations, only quiet, repeated actions across the years. If you believe that a teacher needs no podium, no audience, only sincerity and a heart that points the way, then this story is for you. Some heroes never step onto a stage or make headlines. They live by leaving a bearing for others, and that alone grants them immortality. Please share this story if you believe that gratitude, when offered at the right moment, can become a beacon for generations. And don't forget to subscribe to the Veteran Best Stories channel, where we continue to honor tales of unsung heroes, those who taught us how to navigate, not only the seas, but life itself.